So welcome to the National Cryptologic Foundation virtual presentation, GCHQ, a historical perspective. Just for some background, the foundation was established 25 years ago as the National Cryptologic Museum Foundation. While we were originally incorporated to provide artifacts and financial support to the museum, over the years, our mission has significantly broadened to include a robust education program. Additionally, our newly signed Memorandum of Agreement with NSA provides for an innovative and transparent private-public partnership committed to collaboration in addressing multiple challenges in the cyber domain and contributing to a whole-of-nation approach on cybersecurity and growing cyber talent. We are excited about supporting the needs of the public, students, and NSA. Through the education and outreach programs of the foundation, we heighten public awareness of the cryptologic professions while honoring the people, past, present, and future, whose contributions to our national security protect and make possible our way of life. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. David Sherman, who served for 32 years at the National Security Agency, where he held a variety of managerial, analytic, and staff positions. He also held positions on the staffs of the National Security Council and National Economic Council, and represented NSA to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was Dean of Academic Programs and visiting professor at the National War College from 2007 to 2010. Dave retired from the federal government's senior executive service in 2017. He is also a member of the board of directors of the North American Society for Intelligence History and a proud member of the National Cryptologic Foundation. As a reminder, before we start, everybody please stay on mute if you can, and or please do stay on mute, and put your questions in the chat. And now I'm turning it over to Dave.
Thanks very much, Laura. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two distinguished panelists today, who are not only well known for their accomplishments in their various fields, but I am honored to say are my good friends as well. Tony Comer retired in 2019 after a 37-year career with GCHQ. He began his career as a linguist and, like myself, held a variety of positions across his agency. He became the GCHQ departmental historian in 2009. And upon his retirement 10 years later, I would like to note that he was made a member of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. He tells me he's spent the past 2 years delightfully doing absolutely nothing, which I think is a model that all us retirees can aspire to at some point. John Ferris is professor of history at the University of Calgary. Beyond that, he is a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and he's associated with a number of other universities. He is the author or editor of 8 books and has written over 100 articles on subjects ranging from diplomatic history to intelligence history, military history, and strategy. I think his most recent book, as you know, is the one that we'll be focusing on in part during the course of our conversation today. Behind the Enigma, the Authorized History of GCHQ. And I want to add special emphasis to that word authorized, because that's where we're going to begin in our conversation. I'm going to start with Tony and ask him to speak a little bit about how this book came to be, what was the genesis of it at GCHQ, and what was the thinking that went into, how do we write a public history about a very secret institution? And then we'll turn to John, who will talk about the writing of the book as well as some of his main conclusions. And we'll open it up to your questions after that. There were some questions those of you who may have seen on the registration form that there was a box where people could enter questions for John and Tony. We'll begin with those, and I will pose them to our pair, and then we'll look for your questions in the chat, and I'll be watching them throughout the presentation and get them to, we'll ask them of Tony and John as well as we proceed towards the end. Thanks very much for everyone who is online today with us, and I'll turn it over to Tony to talk about the genesis of the project.
Thanks very much, Dave. I suppose we go back really to about 2010. We'd introduced a badge scheme so that we could commemorate the people who served in SIGINT during the Second World War. We issued a commemorative badge. GCHQ funded a memorial at Bletchley Park itself, which the Queen unveiled subsequently. And I think it was a surprise to us just how much that particular part of our history resonated with so many people. So that's, if you like, a first data point. The next one came in 2012, when it was the centenary of the birth of Alan Turing. And our then director, Ian Lobban, decided that GCHQ should be a part of this centenary in some way. And he did a speech at the University of Leeds, situating, if you like, Alan Turing in GCHQ's history and attempting to correct some of the myths about SIGINT in the Second World War. Brilliant though the cryptanalysts were, for example, the Second World War wasn't won by 5 eccentric mathematicians in a wooden hut in Bletchley Park, and actually try and give a better perspective, not just about SIGINT in the Second World War, but about SIGINT in the 21st century. He had come to realize that GCHQ would need new legislation if it was going to be able to carry on producing intelligence from intercepted signals, and the consent of the British public to what we were doing would effectively need to be accompanied by some better understanding of what we were doing. And the third point really was looking at 2014, which was the centenary of British SIGINT. British SIGINT was founded in the War Office and in the Admiralty in the months following August 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War. And he mused at the time about whether we should be commemorating 2014 as a centenary, or whether we should be focusing on 2019, the foundation of GCHQ as the Government Code and Cipher School. And I think it was easy to persuade him that 2019 was a more appropriate anniversary, but he mused at the time. We'd seen the centenaries of MI5 and MI6 in 2009, and they were relatively muted affairs. There were authorized histories published about the two agencies, but there wasn't sort of great public engagement. But the world was moving on, and something else had happened, of course, by the time we got to 2014, and that was Snowden. Snowden had stolen and made public vast quantities of information about the work of the Five Eyes SIGINT agencies, Ian Lobban himself had been subjected to lots of criticism, lots of personal criticism, as well as there was lots of institutional criticism about the work that the agencies had done. And even though the need to make more public what we did, how we did it legally, and where we'd be going with it became much more important. Even though it had started before Snowden, the momentum that Snowden generated made it more important that we should become more open. And in this context, he asked about whether we should be commissioning a history. My first reaction was just to say, no, let's not commission a history. Let's do something different. Let's just do a large release. Let's get as much of the original documents that we have and just put them into the National Archives and let people read them that way. I won't say he was convinced because it would be 180 degrees different from his actual reaction. But by this time, he was already preparing to leave his post and decided he would leave that to his successor, Robert Hannigan. When Robert became the director, he had me up to his office sort of within his first month to talk about how we were going to celebrate 2019. And he said, and obviously we'll have to have an authorized history as well. I came up with the same argument that I'd done with Ian to say, no, what we should do is just release lots of documents. And he put it to me that I'd got that wrong and that actually we were going to have a history. And funny, him being a director and directing, it meant we were going to have a history. With hindsight, it's sort of pretty obvious anyway. If we were going to release a lot of documents, we would have to have some form of narrative that would explain what it was. Those of you who have ever read SIGINT intelligence reporting will know that it's not for the faint-hearted. Its meanings often don't leap from the page. The way in which we describe the activities of the people that we're reporting on often quite self-referential. You need to have been there to have got it. If we were going to have a history, we needed to sort of think who was going to write it. And one of the things that we were really keen to have was somebody who would focus on the so what. Countless books written about SIGINT in the Second World War, for example, will tell you all about the wiring of the sixth rotor on a German naval M4 or something like that, which is of great interest to a small number of people. But the actual contribution of SIGINT, how did it make a difference? Who saw it? What were the limitations that were put on intelligence, for example, by overemphasis of security? Did SIGINT always make a difference? How many times was SIGINT working just to keep itself going? All those sorts of questions aren't really the stock in trade of most intelligence historians, with one example, or with one exception, and that was John. It was clear to us that John was not only the foremost historian of British SIGINT, but also understood this link. How did SIGINT feed into strategy, into military strategy? How did it feed into foreign policy? And so it became a question of, first of all, finding out whether John was interested in writing the history, whether his university would release him, and how we'd get over the slight problem of his being Canadian and therefore limited in the amount of access that he might be able to have. Again, that was relatively easy to sort out. First of all, we could make sure that we hired a research assistant for John who was British and could be fully cleared and could have unrestricted access to the archives. And the second part of it was that the three of us, Jock, the researcher, John as the historian, and I actually got on and we could talk to each other. So we worked out at a top level what subjects could and couldn't be covered. It was easier to think of blocks of material. We could do diplomatic, for example, up to 1945. We couldn't go beyond that. There would be the opportunity to look at some aspects of SIGINT history in detail, but there'd be other areas where there was particular sensitivities that we wouldn't be able to do. That was straightforward, and from that point, it was a question of John getting access to the original material. He can talk about this himself in a moment. The other really big issue was getting buy-in from stakeholders. And we came across, again, another sort of quite interesting point in itself. There was relatively little that partners in the UK, whether the other intelligence services in the UK, whether the Foreign and Commonwealth Office or the Ministry of Defence, there was relatively little involvement from them because nearly all of the equity in the material that John was saying didn't really affect them at all. The people who had the equities were our Five Eyes partners, and having them on side with what we were doing, persuading them that telling the story at an unclassified level of a very secret organization was, if not a good idea, at least an acceptable idea, and understanding with them where the boundaries were on what we could discuss. How far, for example, could we go into end product reporting? How many of the details that are contained in end product reports could we use? Because the one thing of mine that I insisted on and that we said was that the documents that John was using should all be released. One of the big complaints about the MI5 and MI6 authorized histories is that when you go to the footnotes, you see lots of times just MI5 archives, SIS archives, and no description of the document. We actually wanted to make sure that as many as possible, 95% plus of the documents that John was going to quote in the book would be released as near to the time of the book's publication as possible. And so understanding this would mean a lot of intelligence reports, for example. How set it, again, those of you who worked in the agencies know that, for example, in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, GCHQ certainly was promiscuous in the amount of technical detail that it added to end product reports. Everything from the cipher systems potentially that might have been used, the exact details of the networks on which traffic had been carried, how much of this was actually necessary to support the intention of releasing intelligence. And it did a lot of good for my air miles to have to travel fairly constantly across the Atlantic and to the Southern Hemisphere to sort of talk about the way in which we might get around these problems. But we did reach agreements. They weren't always exactly what we wanted, but we got to the point where we could present John with enough information that he could write something that was coherent and something that would tell the story in the way that we wanted it to be told. You know, how important had GCHQ been in its 100 years of existence to the life of the nation. Where had we made a difference? So I think that's my part of the story, really. At this point, perhaps it's the right time to go over to John to say, well, to give his side of the story.
Good. I'm glad to be here and to speak to the people I see in front of me, including many old friends. And I'd like to say, actually, that for me as a SIGINT historian, the conferences organized by the Center for Cryptologic History in the 1990s and thereafter were fundamental. Really, in order for us who were not members of agencies to understand what had happened, we needed a lot of tuition, and CCH helped to do that. So I'm grateful to be able to publicly say how much of a good job I think they did. Now, biographically, I'm a military historian by background. Probably I'd call myself a strategic historian now. I was working as a PhD student from 1979 to 1986 on the 1920s, British strategic policy. And I can tell you at that time, there was virtually no one working in big issues like military or strategic history in the British archives. There were only a handful of people doing the entire 19th century, for example. As it turned out by accident, I was working in perhaps the area where interwar restrictions on making GCNCS material available to consumers was most relaxed. So I kept stumbling across these odd solutions of foreign diplomatic traffic, which I identified immediately because I'd read David Kahn. And so my notes would include things like they're reading Turkish codes, which I think probably could have been written about any day of the interwar years. Now, at a certain stage, I started to say, well, if I'm stumbling across these things by accident, could I find them more specifically? And everyone I talked to told me it couldn't be done. The general consensus among academics in the early 1980s was you couldn't write about the government code in cipher school because the material had all been removed from the files. Because I'd seen enough by accident, I thought, well, let's see what I can do. And I'll be honest, the idea of tackling a technically very challenging problem caught my attention. And so what I did from, I'd say, the early 1980s until probably 10 years ago was to collect material on British SIGINT and try to marry it with policy. I had other projects as well. I've got a career as a student of Anglo-Japanese strategic relations in the 19th and 20th century. But SIGINT was always high on my list. And one of the key things is to remember how little we as outsiders knew at the start. The only other person who really was working systematically in those files at that time was Brad Smith, my late friend, very good friend. And I remember Brad saying to me, as soon as we move a step away from established fact, we're in danger of walking into quicksand. So simply trying to build a context was something that was really very important to me. And as time went by, I think I built it. And oddly enough, the figure who allowed me to finally put it all together was none other than young Eddie Snowden. Because when I went through the material he had illicitly leaked, I was able to then see how the role of cyber intelligence was after the Cold War, which allowed me in some ways to triangulate what had happened during the Cold War. So when I was approached by GCHQ, I was actually working on some big projects. I intended to actually write a history on British code breaking from before the First World War through to the end of the Second. And so Tony's offer was something I was very interested in. As we discovered, trying to get my university and GCHQ to find ways to cooperate proved to be extremely difficult. And it had nothing to do with issues of high policy. It was all about the fact that at GCHQ, the issue was managed by people who bought and sold computers. At the University of Calgary, the issue was managed by people who protected the intellectual property of academics. And although they shared a common law tradition, I can tell you it took about 9 months of confusion before we could finally get anywhere at all. Tony and I think, were the only people who understood the process at all. Now, when I went into the project, Tony and I defined what it was we would let me see and write about and what we wouldn't. And I was perfectly happy to live with the constraints, in the sense that be able to say anything meaningful and significant about the history of SIGINT to me was very interesting, especially in the Cold War. I understood the political ramifications of not releasing some material. The original aim was that we would end with the end of the Cold War, which made sense to me, although by the end of the project, in effect, we decided to carry it as far forward into the current period as we could, based primarily on interviews and open sources. So I think what we end up with my history is a broad account of how signals intelligence develops from the late 19th century through to the present day, from the perspective of perhaps the most successful agency of that period. The only competitor really is NSA. I don't think that there's any other agency that can be compared to GCHQ and NSA in terms of their longevity and success. Now, I would also say that if you're going to criticize the book, there are certain ways you can do it. I was writing for different audiences. I was writing for you. I was writing for people who were serving SIGINTers or retired SIGINTers. And I wanted to say to them, look, this is your history, even though you don't know a lot of it. I was also trying to write for a popular audience and get them to appreciate what had happened with signals intelligence over this period. And I must say, I also aimed to try to demystify the nature of SIGINT. I believe that mystification and secrecy have been fundamental to the way everyone looks at the history of SIGINT. And that has, I think, created some of the suspicion about and some of the hostility towards SIGINT on the part of broader or smaller audiences. Now, when the topics were presented to me by Tony, there were a few that I suggested that we had. And we agreed to do that. So for example, I spent a lot of time in the social history of GCHQ, looking at the role of women, looking at who radio operators were, looking at how recruitment and training work, looking at who works in the agency over a long period of time, trying to look for patterns in recruitment, workforces, etc. Now, I actually believe that in the long run, that's going to be a very important part of the book. I can also tell you that virtually not one review has commented on it. But that doesn't bother me, because in the long run, anyone who reads the book will say, well, this is what SIGINTs were like, is it? This is kind of like looking at a social history of an Air Force or a Navy or an Army or a diplomatic service. But I think there were certain things that was obvious all along I was going to write. And I'll turn now to the one which I think is most on the mind of people here, and that's the nature of the SIGINT relationship, first of all, between Britain and the United States, but secondly, between the Five Eyes generally. Now, I can tell you that, like I think most people working in SIGINT or working in intelligence history who had no background in the agencies, when I first heard in the 1980s, it seemed very unlikely to me. The idea that you could have the most secret agencies of several sovereign states cooperating with each other with extreme closeness on technical issues, exchanging product constantly and freely, not behaving in a purely transactional manner, seemed to me very unlikely. So it took me time as I worked as an intelligence historian to say, well, obviously, however odd this relationship is, it works. And I will say that going through the material that I received from GCHQ, which is by no means the whole story, each of the Five Eyes could write an account of their relationship with all of their Five Eyes partners, which would be different than the one I did. And there's no question that mine is written from a British perspective, and perhaps there's some partiality. I would say that if I'm writing without really clearly knowing what's on the inside of American or Canadian or Australian documents, I wouldn't expect to be right at every judgment as an historian. But I did make a broad attempt to explain how it worked. Now, what struck me about Ukuza is how much it actually is a simple continuation of strategic relations between the British and Americans, and more broadly the Commonwealth in the Second World War. And at a certain stage, I simply said to myself, well, interesting. This is the one part of that relationship of the Second World War that never stops. In every other area you can look at in terms of Anglo-American strategic or intelligence cooperation, there are periods around the end of the Second World War where there's a breakdown in the intimacy of relationships, which usually is improved somewhat. But in the case of GCHQ and the American military service, SIGINT intelligence agencies, later NSA, there is no break. And indeed, the continuity between people who are practitioners in the early 1940s, particularly young people who are coming in to the agencies as they expand, continues on to the 1970s. And so to me, it was clear that we were looking at an unusual phenomenon in a lot of ways. Not merely is there no other power political relationship I know of where there's so much sharing of secret material between agencies, which also hide that material from their other national agencies, but also the mere fact that it continues from a moment when every member of the Anglo world feels as though they have their back to the wall, and for some reason, and that we need to band together in order to handle threats. Now, what I would say about looking at the material I had access to regarding Ukuza is that it's very clear that in the waning months of the Second World War, the British, with a lot of effort, and the Americans with somewhat less effort, turned the focus of their SIGINT effort from Germany and Japan toward Russia. And what that means is that although they have not treated Russia as a major target from 1941 to 1944, by the time the summer of 1945 rolls around, there's actually a fairly high level of technical access. And the British and Americans both start out doing fairly well in their attacks on Soviet traffic, which then is damaged by the fact that American traders betray British secrets, British traders betray American secrets, which damages all of us in the long run. Now, from that moment on, looking at the records, what became clear is just how difficult it was to disentangle the way Ukuza worked from the normal working of the agencies. Something that struck me going through the many oral interviews on NSA people and American SIGINT is the following point. They very rarely refer to GCHQ. But then suddenly what will happen is the GCHQ will be mentioned or arise in a discussion, and immediately what you will get is usually quite an enthusiastic set of comments by American SIGINT leaders saying, yes, it's a very good relationship. They are very good. They provide a lot of material to us that we would find hard to acquire. And in a lot of ways, what struck me there is that we're looking at, on the one hand, a very close, intimate relationship, which on the other hand, doesn't affect most of the day-to-day operations of either agency. So there's a tendency, I think, among American SIGINTers to, when they're thinking about their broader problems, to think primarily about their American counterparts, not surprisingly. And when they think about the relationship with the Five Eyes, it's more in the matter of saying, okay, there is a relationship, what does it provide us? Now, looking at that relationship as a whole in the Cold War, what I would say is that the strengths and the weaknesses are obvious. The strengths are that it allowed the British and Americans, who were the leading SIGINT powers of 1945, the Soviets were not in your league, to build a relationship where they could each support each other, develop relative strengths, and cooperate against a target for a very long period of time. The problems are that over the course of the Cold War, especially in the 1970s, there's a period of several years where the British state is uncertain about how it should finance GCHQ and how it should treat UKUZA. Now, I would say that looking at British strategic policy as a whole from 1945 to the present day, for almost all of the time, Britain's leading strategic priorities are number one, the deterrent, and number one, GCHQ. They're more or less tied, although GCHQ doesn't require nearly as much money as the nuclear deterrent has done historically. But in the 1970s, the British are not certain whether they should keep GCHQ at that status. And there's no question that there's a lot of criticism emerging within, especially the American service SIGINT agencies, about the British not really providing the material which the Americans needed. Now, a lot of this stemmed from turf struggles in the 1970s. American service SIGINT agencies are facing financial crises. They're looking for ways to have additional finance coming in to help them sustain their numbers. But nonetheless, there's a general sense on the part of American decision makers in the 1970s that maybe UKUZA is declining in its value. Now, as it turns out, historically, in the early 1980s, especially after the Falklands War, where SIGINT really saved bacon, Mrs. Thatcher's government provides far more money to GCHQ than had been done by governments in the 1970s, and it manages to end the Cold War, improving its relative position in the United States. Now, interestingly, when we come to the Cold War, or the post-Cold War era, the Five Eyes relationship continues. And I must say that at this stage, my access to material declines dramatically. And it's more a series of comments from an outsider. Clearly, British and American governments conclude that continuing this relationship is a worthwhile thing, simply because it's worked so well in the past. And I would say that actually that pays off well for both British and Americans, because the early 1990s marks what I would call one of the two revolutions in SIGINT, and it creates what I'd call the second age of SIGINT. And the fact that the British and Americans, good agencies, both, confront similar organizational and structural problems and pursue independent solutions to those problems and illuminate to their partner their experiences, I think that goes a long way to explaining how it is the Five Eyes partnership, especially after 9/11, again becomes as powerful and lively as it had been before. Now, at that stage, I'd also say that relationships with second parties become more complex and intimate than I think they had been during the Cold War itself. And some of the ways that UKUZA had worked in the Cold War no longer are followed to the letter. Which leads us to my final comments on UKUZA. I think that looking at the past 60 years, UKUZA is a success story which is not fully appreciated by even the bulk of students of international security and relations. I see it as one of the bulwarks of Western power in the course of the Cold War. And that's partly because it's an intelligence alliance, but also partly because it helps to keep a military alliance going. As a Canadian, my observation of the way we Anglos behave with each other in military terms is to say that there is clearly an implicit military alliance, which bolsters all of us. The Americans get a lot out of it, although not as much as the rest of us do from the United States. And the existence of UKUZA helps to keep that relationship going. So although I don't like terms like the Anglosphere very much, I would say that we're dealing with a situation where there's an unusual harmony of strategic and military policy. But my book includes questions at the very end saying, will UKUZA continue? partly because I have heard enough senior SIG-Inters on the British and American side, or middle-level ones, speculate on that issue. And it's clear that they're not certain of the outcome. And also because the reason UKUSA has worked up to the present moment is because the interests of its members, or more broadly of the Five Eyes, have been similar enough that we don't conflict openly on existential issues. We don't use the intelligence we gather against each other. And it is possible that we could be heading toward a breakdown in the consensus that Americans and Brits or Canadians or Kiwis might think that we should all be working together. And I will say that political events the past several years certainly have caused me to wonder whether the harmony that saw us through the Second World War, the Cold War, and therefore made military and SIG-Int cooperation possible, can plausibly continue. I hope that it does, because I actually think that UKUSA has been a very important component of our power and ability to survive in an unpleasant world. But I would say that I'm not entirely certain that that will be the case. So I'm happy to talk about anything else, but I did put in those points about UKUSA because I think that is what a lot of you are interested in talking about. So thank you.
Thank you, John and Tony. We'll start, as I said at the beginning, with the questions that were sent in with registration forms. And the way I'll proceed is usually I'll ask either John or Tony to lead off in addressing the question, and then the other one can comment. So I've sort of parsed the questions into ones that deal with the past and ones that deal with the future, which is the era that John was just talking about. But we'll begin with the past, and I think I'll start out this way with a question for Tony. There was a question about the different names that have existed for British SIG-Int over the years, and particularly in the last 100, commemorated by the centenary a few years ago, specifically the Government Code and Cipher School and Government Communications Headquarters, its modern name. Could you talk a little bit about how those names evolved and why they evolved the way they did?
I mean, the idea of Government Code and Cipher School, I think it was the former ambassador to Peru, who was working in the Foreign Office, who actually said, we need a Code and Cipher School to do the overt work. Bear in mind, until April 1946, British SIG-Int was on the open vote. You could read the budget statements and see how much everybody in GC and CS earned. You could see exactly how many grades there were. You could see there was a coal porter, not a songwriter, but a man who actually took coal from room to room. All of these details were in the public domain. And so Code and Cipher School was a completely honest and accurate description of the work of a small part of the organization. And it made what seemed like a good cover story. Nobody seems to have publicly associated the Code and Cipher School with cryptanalysis and intelligence production. It was when they went to Bletchley Park in August 1939 that it was felt that some explanation had to be given for what the organization was. Government Code and Cipher School, it was not the appropriate title. So it was put about that the organization had something to do with the air defense of London. A bit odd that these people should have moved out of London some 60 or 70 miles. And especially it was odd to wonder what all these university professors were doing about the air defense of London. So Nigel De Grey, who was one of the senior members of staff he'd been out of the organisation between the wars, but had come back at the beginning of September 1939. In October, came up with Government Communications Headquarters as a cover title, and had a great sign made that was put up at the entrance to the organisation, that was taken down later the same day. It was room 17 at the Foreign Office. It had sort of 2 or 3 different cover names, but by the end of the war, in 1946, when it had been decided, obviously, that the organisation was going to continue during the Cold War, and as GCHQ moved on to it moved away from being on the open vote, the title Government Communications Headquarters was adopted as a new title for the Code and Cipher School, but only at unclassified and restricted. At confidential, secret, and top secret, it would be called the London Signals Intelligence Centre. And this idea that you could have an organisation with different titles depending on the classification at which it was being referred to continued until 1948, when, especially as and Cheltenham, a title of the organisation beginning with London Signals Intelligence Centre was just quietly dropped, and the organisation became Government Communications Headquarters of classification. Been pretty stable since then. It's a relatively meaningless cover term, but it's been enshrined in law. Now it talks about Government Communications Headquarters. It would need legal change to change the name of the organisation, so that name.
John, any comments?
It makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, from 1942 onward, there are quite a number of different names applied to what we would call British SIGINT. And the same is true of all British intelligence agencies. SIS was called the Inter-Service Liaison Department, for example, in memorandum of the Second World War. The British love having many different names for the same thing. And I think that it works. To me, the astounding thing is that no foreign power actually uses the fact that you have access to the names and pay of every single member, as it turns out, of British SIGINT in order to figure out how British SIGINT works. So this is actually a means by which the British could have compromised a great deal about their intelligence service that nobody picks up.
Thank you. A little bit of time at the end, John. I'll start with you for this question and then go to Tony. Talking about the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom in signals intelligence. A couple questions that we received focus on partners other than those two. Specifically, the relationship with the French. What did you learn about that? And then also, coming back just to the Five Eyes briefly, what did you get the sense that the Five Eyes, aside from the U.S. and the U.K., that the other three, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, play supporting roles or broadly, or are they focused in particular areas?
The issue, to answer the last question, depends on the time period. During the Cold War, as I'm quoting something Tony said to me many times, Dominion SIGINT essentially focuses on niche areas where it can acquire material nobody else can acquire and therefore contribute to the common pot. Since the rise of the internet, my sense is that certainly the Australians and Canadians have become more general service in their approach towards SIGINT. This is based entirely on observing publicly available information, not on anything I've seen from the inside. I was constrained from saying anything in the book very much about relations with second parties because it became politically very complicated. I could have said more than I did. What I did say is that the way that SIGINT works in NATO in the Cold War is, I think, militarily disastrous in case there had been any kind of major conflict. The way that the three partners from UKUZA who operate in NATO, Canada, Great Britain, and the United States, shared their SIGINT but did not pool it with other people's SIGINT, meant that you were creating real structural problems in the distribution of intelligence. And there are a couple of commands in NATO where commanders, in fact, don't in peacetime have access to even understanding what it is that UKUZA could provide in terms of war. So structurally, I would say that NATO actually suffered dramatically from the creation of UKUZA. As far as the second parties go, some of them are very good. Some of them aren't. My own sense would be that the Dutch are good. The Germans are okay, but not great. French, probably I'd say the same thing about. But I didn't see much material on it. And I would not put too much weight on what I've just said as far as assessing second parties or third parties.
Anything to add, Tony?
The French are the UK's oldest SIGINT partner. The French in 1912 tried to persuade the UK to develop some form of cryptanalytic bureau. There's an Anglo-French code book issued in 1912. Politically, the UK couldn't be seen to be allying itself with France against Germany, but the staff talks between the two general staffs were progressing, and it meant that the British Expeditionary Force in August 1914 could go to France, where immediately its intelligence section was taught by the French how to do SIGINT in the field. And that's a relationship that's had sort of quite high ups and quite low downs over a century and a little bit. But I think there is perhaps a closer relationship with the French than with most other NATO partners, simply because the UK and France have been involved in so much activity together. I agree with everything John said about NATO in the Cold War. And I think that's improved subsequently. I think, for example, in Afghanistan, I think understanding that the constraints that security put on intelligence sharing had such a negative impact, and perhaps to a certain extent the lessons of the Balkans and the way that NATO worked in the Balkans were also a way of saying we're going to have to do this differently for the future.
John, I think I'll address this question solely to you because it was a topic that you covered in your remarks. It has to do with the nuclear arrangements and that emerged at the end of the 1950s, and whether or not the closeness of the SIGINT relationship between the two countries that had emerged during the Second World War and continued into the Cold War, whether that in any way facilitated the or influenced or made more palatable the nuclear understandings.
Well, one of the hidden things that Britain contributes to the West's nuclear posture is providing a lot of material on Soviet nuclear developments and capabilities. GCHQ appears in the late 50s with a relatively small investment to have been able to acquire enough material from telemetry of Soviet nuclear forces, especially in Central Asia, that it really is able to heighten the level of our knowledge of Soviet nuclear forces. Now, this is an area where the historical literature really has not been fully developed. I have seen material and I've written about it, but I can also say that the people who work in, say, American nuclear strategy in the 1950s and 1960s don't, in my opinion, really integrate intelligence into their discussion of nuclear issues. But in essence, the famous national technical means of verification of SALT actually, in some cases, are referring to British national means of verification because they're providing the material directly to you. So in that sense, this is an area where the British make a contribution to Western security, which in turn, I think, bolsters its credibility in the NSA and bolsters British credibility in DC generally.
Thank you, John. I think I'll start with Tony on this one, and it's the last question, sort of about the past, and then push it over to John as well. Tony, in the course of working with John and of John's research, what surprised you in terms of maybe seeing, hey, this is a really big issue that actually NSA and GCHQ differed on during the post-war period?
I won't quite answer your question. I'll answer the question I wish you'd asked.
Okay, that's totally okay.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd never really focused on before, that came out of seeing what John was making of the material, was that the UK realised that, if you like, GCHQ realised that NSA had become far and away the senior partner in the relationship before NSA did. GCHQ realised that it was no longer an equal partner in terms of the amount of investment that it was making, in terms of its size, in terms of what it was putting into the common pot. And it spent that time sort of thinking, to a certain extent at least, about what would the relationship be like with an NSA as senior partner. And I think quite remarkably, the reaction wasn't to say, well, let's try and hem NSA in, let's try and force them to sign all sorts of agreements about the way things will work, but was to sort of accept that the partnership, being the way it was, would evolve naturally. Again, I think there's a key point comes in about 1964 or 5, when the partners agree they're no longer going to have these big conferences every 2 or 3 years to rewrite the Yakuza agreement and all the masses of appendices and annexures and what have you, and simply just meet when you've got a problem and just sort it out. A really pragmatic solution. And I think that was my big surprise, that you didn't really have the two organizations sort of monolithically facing each other in disagreement. That when problems arose, the problems were delegated to people who could solve them, and they were basically just sent off to get them sorted.
Before I turn it over to John, let me just add a footnote from my work. It's very clear to me that during World War II, although it may have taken the Americans a little while to realize it, and realize that they did, that the British were the senior partner in the relationship. That seems crystal clear to me from my own reading and study of the matter. But John, let me kick it over to you in terms of, an issue where you discovered, hey, there's a real disagreement here between NSA and GCHQ.
First of all, what I would say is that the relationships between NSA and GCHQ end up being remarkably close because they're not competitors and they become allies. Whereas for NSA, unlike in the case of Britain, in effect, GCHQ absorbs the service SIGINT agencies. and takes direction over them by the early 1960s and has more power over them than I think NSA today has over American service SIGINT. But in essence, because of that, NSA could trust GCHQ to have its back. And the end result was that GCHQ and NSA created a relationship which was very close and also unlike the relationship between American and British SIGINT more generally. Because American service SIGINT agencies, I think, and we have to look at their records much more than anyone else has been able to do in the public domain, I think are much more critical of the relationship with the British than NSA is. So the end result is that on the issue of how does NSA function, GCHQ is maybe its only friend. Outside of dogs, as I understand, in Washington, they're people's friends as well. Now, as far as conflicts go, I couldn't fully address the biggest conflict, which is over American cryptography and that of any other country. Because cryptography in the United States case is dominated by the service SIGINT agencies. They have much more power over that issue than they have over cryptanalysis. And the end result is that if you look at British cryptography, the people in charge of it have a much weaker bargaining position with the United States than GCHQ itself generally does. And that's linked to lots of issues which are still highly secret. You know, the material that's come out about relationships between CIA, other American agencies, Swiss manufacturers of cipher machines, etc. Now, what that meant was that if I'd fully tried to describe the cryptographic side, I couldn't have done so. If I'd written even what I knew at the time, I don't think that it would have passed NSA's willingness to support it. I don't see that as being a big issue. The United States is simply looking after its cryptographic side. The services don't trust anyone else, including each other. And it's not surprising that they're very tough-minded on those issues. When I look at the crises where Anglo-American relationships have been most tested, which is, say, Cyprus, 1973-74, and Suez, 1956. Although there are tensions between the British and American governments, and to some degree over SIGINT, to me, the surprising thing from the documents I can see is that GCHQ and NSA worked together quietly in order to try to contain the crisis, although in both cases, things could become much worse. So my own view is that unless you were to face a major clash of British and American interests, where one side felt the need to use SIGINT as a tool against the other, short of that, I don't see any reason to believe that these crises matter very much in Anglo-American SIGINT relations, specifically between GCHQ and NSA.
We're going to turn now to questions about the future, and this will involve taking out our crystal balls. Right? We all need to add a couple of grains of salt to this part of the discussion. But John, I'll begin with you for this one. You know, obviously, you talked about the future of the SIGINT relationship, and we can talk about that further. But what one person asked was, you know, kind of a very interesting question about how GCHQ will continue to assert its independence regardless of whichever political party is in power. And I think that's a question that obviously, you know, in the last few years has arisen regarding American intelligence agencies as well, including NSA. And there are any number of reasons why this is coming up. But let's focus in on GCHQ and its independence within the British political system, and then turn it over to Tony after John's comment.
Well, GCHQ is still a remarkably autonomous agency. It is more autonomous, by which I mean it is open to self-direction, than is true, I'd say, of the British military services of the Foreign Office. In that context, Basically, not that many decision makers fully understand how GCHQ works, although dissemination of product is much wider than it was at the end of the Cold War. Historically, GCHQ made it through the Cold War with Labour as a political party moving, I suppose, from what you might call relatively conservative social democrats to a faction which always is quite left-wing. Had Jeremy Corbyn become prime minister, I believe there would have been a major crisis over GCHQ because Jeremy Corbyn really cared more about foreign and external policy than is true of most British prime ministers. And he really did not like things like nuclear weapons, NATO, intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So I can conceive of circumstances where GCHQ would face problems from the left, but I don't actually think that's likely to be an issue. Certainly the pressure on GCHQ and British intelligence has been much less than was true in the past several years in Washington with American intelligence services. I think they generally prefer to keep it a national bipartisan issue. And let me note that if you view how the British responded to the Snowden disclosures, the British government and all the leaders of the three major British political parties covered and protected GCHQ. So Labour and the Social Democrats and the Conservatives all said, we knew all of this. It had been properly disclosed to us. There is nothing here that was done that is any way illegal. And that kind of bipartisan approach, I think, will continue because in the end, the British culture about foreign policy is somewhat more hard-headed and realist than I think is true in DC, and far, far more than is true in Ottawa, I can tell you.
Tony?
I've nothing sort of major to add, but I would note that the GCHQ, certainly as an agency, doesn't do sort of its own strategic assessment. GCHQ's job is to input information, to input intelligence that other people will assess. And while that's obviously a sort of line that's blurred, if you're the only agency producing intelligence on a particular subject, you are obviously the intelligence that you produce has a disproportionate influence on what's going to happen. But I think there's a mindset issue that says that traditionally GCHQ's intelligence has just been something that GCHQ puts onto a table, and it therefore is a lot harder to politicize the agency. What other people might do with the intelligence subsequently could be very political, but at that point, that's not an agency issue. It's the people using it. How far cybersecurity changes this, I think, is going to be something really interesting to watch over the next few years. Cyber's different. Cyber is ourselves, our customers, our adversaries potentially all sitting on the same server, all trying to look at the traffic that's passing through that server. How do relationships work there? How do you explain cyber to a minister, a secretary of state who's got a fixed amount of time that he can devote to trying to understand issues? From that point of view, again, intelligence, as long as you're not trying to get the minister to understand the sort of the technical details of how you're going to get down to a voice grade channel from some massive multiplex system, he's not interested in that. If you're just giving intelligence, the minister's going to understand it. How can you give information about the internet to people and have them understand where you're coming from? I think it's going to be interesting to see how that develops in the next few years.
Yes.
Thanks. The next question, it's both specific, but it opens up a very wide range of issues related to GCHQ and NSA, I suppose, their public face, their interactions with the public. It deals specifically with how can GCHQ and NSA work more effectively in unclassified environments to incorporate the exponentially growing amount of unclassified public information. But I would also push it out a little bit further and say, it wouldn't surprise me if in over the past 2 years, with governments issuing stay-at-home orders or recommending social distancing or what have you, that secret work is hard to conduct any place other than a secret facility. It would seem. And so, I suspect that a lot of creative thinking and new thinking and hard thinking was done at the agencies in terms of, well, how do we deal with environments like this? How long are we going to be in these environments? But let's focus in specifically on the question of work, increase working out in public in an unclassified way, with unclassified public information. And let's start this time with John and go to Tony.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that if I look at my own lifetime, when I started thinking about SIGINT, which is really the very late 1970s, virtually nothing was known. And the approach toward protecting the security of SIGINT among the agencies of the Five Eyes was really what I'd call anal retentive. There was a real reluctance to admit anything more than you needed to admit. So if there was any single piece of information I found interesting as I went through the work, it was to find that even in the late 70s and the early 80s, the British government is still believing that it can actually contain any dissemination of technical developments of the early and middle 1940s. In other words, things leading up to Enigma. Now, if we look at what has happened, I would say increasingly from the mid-90s, and certainly in the past decade, the SIGINT agencies in Britain and the United States have become remarkably open. They're open to many different communities. We're dealing with me as an academic, but the communities involving businesses, high-tech firms, businesses who might need advice in cyber has become increasingly significant. And what I notice is the increasing degree to which the agencies of the Five Eyes, the SIGINT agencies of the Five Eyes, are clearly involved in making public statements of warning to normal people or to specific audiences of businessmen or tech people about problems they confront. So there is, first of all, a major move toward openness as a whole. How far you can carry that while maintaining the level of secrecy that is needed for SIGINT to function is an important issue. And without question, SIGINTers will put their thumb on the scale to ensure that secrecy is protected, as they should. I don't have any problems with that. So I'm perhaps more optimistic on these issues than a lot of people are. I find myself, when I'm talking to other academics about these issues, saying, well, look, in my lifetime, the change has been pretty significant, and there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue. And the final point is that, as Tony said, we're in a different age with cyber. Every way that SIGINT works with official agencies and with private organizations is open to change. The rules that prevailed in the 20th century will not prevail in the 21st. So the game is going to evolve in ways that don't follow the patterns of the past. And I think one of my points would be that although you need to know history, that's partly so you can also disregard historical experience at certain points and say, that was true at the time, but it doesn't work now. Whereas this other thing was true at the time and still remains true today.
Thanks, John. Tony, anything to add about the area of public work?
I think just a couple of points, and I think John's really covered it rather well. The first is a difference, certainly in the UK, between GCHQ on the one hand and MI5, MI6 on the other. And that is because we're based in Cheltenham and not in London. It's absolutely impossible for people who work at GCHQ to pretend that they work somewhere else. We are open as an organisation in a way I think that relatively few intelligence agencies in the world are open. We can't say that we work at the Ministry of Defence. We can't say anything like that. We work at GCHQ. And since 1984, everybody knows what GCHQ is and does. So there's a mindset issue that's perhaps slightly different and that has made it easier to take on this role of saying, well, what's the irreducible core of our business that we must keep secret, and do we need to make the rest of it? I think it's possibly been slightly easier, just slightly easier for us to do that. I think the other point I'd make is a thing that I saw during my career. I went from being part of an organisation that served the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence to one that provided intelligence to government, that from 1994 supported work on serious crime and the economic well-being of the country, to one that certainly in terms of cybersecurity is serving the citizen, is serving everybody. It's making sure that all of our systems, all of the country's systems are secure. And that's a journey rather than a destination. I have no idea how that, again, it's another example of cyber changing things dramatically. And as John says, that we need to know what the old answers to the questions were, but while recognizing that it may well be that they're no longer relevant, that we need to think of new ways of being an intelligence and security organization in the 21st century.
It also seems, Tony, that process you just outlined is additive. In other words, you don't abandon traditional topics of interest when you take on something like narcotics and serious crime or cybersecurity. It all goes into the mix. Let me exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask a speculative question that deals with current events, and it has to do with Russia and Ukraine, which I know is present in all of our minds at the moment. Wondering what's going to happen next, and I'm not going to ask you what's going to happen next, but I was wondering if John, I know you devote a chapter in the book to GCHQ's work with regard to Russian topics. And I was wondering, is there anything from that you took away from that work that help you understand or help you get a feel for the situation that GCHQ may be facing now with regard to Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the real dilemma, as always with SIGINT, when you're trying to assess the intentions of another state, is can you get inside the mind of the key decision maker? And I think we would agree that Vladimir Putin is indeed in a position to decide what Russia will do. We're not going to read his mind. This is typical. We couldn't read the mind of Adolf Hitler. We could read what people who were talking to him or had talked to him could say. But then in a lot of cases, what you're reading are the opinions of people who are trying to impress Hitler or to shape decisions from a lower level. So I would say that on the biggest issue that we're talking about, which is to say, what will Russia do? SIGINT is not likely to give you a clear answer. If the question is, can you contextualize how important people within I keep wanting to say Soviet, but important people within the Russian system are thinking and behaving. Well, SIGINT will give you lots and lots of material. And so at least you can have a sense of the atmosphere for decision making. Finally, my own sense is that SIGINT will be able to provide a lot of general military intelligence, which is going to be very useful. You know, as a military historian, I look at this and I say, well, gee, at the moment the Russians have like 100,000 men surrounding Ukraine, 100,000 men, that's not exactly a huge strength. So in the end, what I would say is that to expect the ability to predict what Putin will do is not possible. To have a clear sense of what his policy will be, SIGINT will provide more material than any other source. And really, in the end, though, the question is the stability, certainty, wisdom, intelligence of the people who are assessing material. And this is a fairly constant problem historically when it comes to SIGINT. There are some questions that it doesn't answer particularly well, and there are other questions that it answers very well. And intentions on the part of a small number of decision makers, rarely do you get something direct from the horse's mouth.
John, I think those are excellent points, and I'll just ask Tony if he has anything to add before we turn to a couple of the questions that have come in over the chat.
I think briefly, it's a perfect example of what we're saying about understand your history, but don't necessarily think you've got to do things the same way. If you look at all of the Soviet military end product reporting that GCHQ released covering the period 1945 to 1950, you can see exactly the issues that John's talking about, that, you know, you're trying to build up ORBAT, you're trying to understand communications networks, you're trying to draw conclusions about working out what indicators are and what warnings some of those indicators can give you. The answer isn't to create a whole load of stations in Germany trying to pick up HF Morse communications. It's not to rebuild A group in NSA or J division in GCHQ, because the world is a different place. But you've got those clues, as John says. SIGINT will give you ORBAT, SIGINT will give you indicators and warning. SIGINT is very unlikely to give you intention or anything like that. That's not where you should be looking at. That's the intelligence that you want to get. So I'll use the word again. What was the mindset of the people in 1945 who were starting to work in detail on this big new target? You need to be able to try and replicate the mindset, but you need new tools because you're facing an adversary who's using completely novel communication systems and in a different world.
Thanks. We have time just for maybe two questions from the chat, which I select fairly arbitrarily, unfortunately, and I apologize that. And then I'll kick it back to Laura for any concluding remarks she might have. The first question is from Richard Brisson, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. And it's to John, really. You know, it has to do with oral histories. You mentioned, you know, having access to documents through arrangements with GCHQ. Access to oral histories is part of that, or otherwise. And how important were they?
The British have an oral history program, but it is less well developed than the one that CCH has developed over the years. So I don't think they have the bank of oral reporting, oral interviews that NSA has. And if I'm wrong, Tony's free to correct me. What I did have was the ability to interview a number of senior people in GCHQ, including, I think, most of the surviving directors of GCHQ. Now, what I found was that they were, if anything, willing to be more frank and open with me than GCHQ would have liked. In other words, they thought they were free to talk about anything they wanted, and essentially they did. So I could ask very detailed probing questions. And what you'll find is that a lot of my analysis reflect the comments I received, but I couldn't quote them. So I'll give one example without citing the name. When I talk about how the British legal apparatus no longer really was directed to handle the way SIGINT was collected in the cyber age, in the period before young Eddie releases things. One of my questions was, well, why did this happen? And the answer very clearly in the end was that this was a complex issue. People realized within the government that in fact the law didn't work particularly well, but there were so many different people that have to agree in order for anything to be done. But in the end, nothing was done. And simply to be able to say that this is why the British ended up being exposed to this particular problem was useful. And I'd say that I got a lot of useful material from my interviews with people whom I was never able to mention. Let's put it that way. The interviews were conducted with Jock Bruce, who was my research assistant with me, able to remind any director that maybe they shouldn't be talking about these issues. But I think that Jock preferred not to say that. And if he had, none of them would have paid attention to it.
Thanks, John. I think we're approaching the end of the 90 minutes at this point. So I think I will proceed to start to wrap things up. I know I speak for everyone in the audience and the foundation for thanking Dr. John Ferris and Mr. Tony Comer for what I think was a fascinating 90 minutes of discussion on these very important topics. And you know, I don't know if you can see it, given that we're in smaller boxes today, but behind me is John's book, Behind the Enigma. I highly recommend it. It is full of fascinating information and analysis that will be of interest to anyone who is interested in GCHQ, NSA, intelligence. It is really a real resource and a wonderful read. And John, I think you succeeded in writing it for the specialist and the general reader. So very well done. With that, I will pass it back to Laura at the foundation for any final remarks that she wishes to make. And again, I apologize that we were not able to get to everyone's questions. With that, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Dave, Tony, and John for sharing your perspectives on GCHQ's history and a reminder of the enduring partnership between GCHQ and NSA. Also, thank you to all of our attendees today. It is through your support we're able to provide these programs. Of course, we welcome your donations to help us further our mission and reach. We accept all forms of currency, including cryptocurrency. Please visit our website at cryptologicfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. And that concludes our program for today. Thank you all.